All right, today we are going to talk about the Patagonian Mara, very cool species of the day here. I've had a lot of repeats, and this one certainly isn't. It is a animal from Argentina. They prefer arid grasslands and brushlands with a lot of open space, consuming grasses. They also eat cacti, seeds, fruits, and flowers. They can live for about 14 years in captivity, and there's a little video there if you want to give it a try. We also have the bat-eared fox, another good one, found also in grasslands and savannas. They like short grass. They mostly eat the insects that are living in those grasslands. They are sometimes hunted for fur, and they are at risk of disease. And disease is actually our topic for today, which is why these guys are on here. And they, like some talked about recently, get their water from the foods that they eat. And we have the white rhinoceros, approximately 20,000 left in the world, previously threatened, mainly eat grass as well. Second largest land mammal in the world after the elephant. They're calmer and more sociable than other rhinos and live in small territorial groups and can live for up to 50 years in the wild. So today's topic is on wildlife disease. So we're going to talk about this as being a present threat. I mean, animals have had disease for a very, very long time, but what we're actually seeing is that it's emerging, or perhaps they're having more extreme disease events than have happened in the past. So we'll talk a little bit about that. So wildlife disease, why do we care? Well, wildlife disease can be caused by pathogens, pollutants, genetics, or dietary deficiencies, and it can threaten vulnerable wildlife populations, just like overhunting does or habitat destruction does. And part of the reason that we care is that reports indicate that over 75% of new pathogens in humans come from animals. Obviously, we're home right now with COVID-19, and that is relevant today, but we're also going to talk about a lot of other examples of we care about wildlife pathogens because they can sometimes transfer to humans. That's the biggest reason. And then the secondary reason is we care about healthy ecosystems because we realize how important that is and we want animals to be healthy as well. So, we're going to talk today about disease, we're going to talk about pathogens, and we're going to talk a little bit about vectors. We got heavy vocabulary today. If you like to take notes for use on your test, today is a good day to maybe pause this video, grab a piece of paper and a pencil so you can jot stuff down. So, disease. Disease can be enzootic. That means it's like a chronic, kind of constant level of disease that's in the population. It kind of always happens. I mean, this could literally be colds. Like, there's always some animal, some wild dogs with a cold. This could be plague. It could be Lyme disease. But things that, like, there's always some individuals who might be suffering from it, but it doesn't become an entire population problem. And then we have epizootic, which is when there's a disease outbreak. So this is where a lot of animals or members of a population are all affected at the same time. So in one species, for instance, a cold could be minor and no big deal, and then it could jump to a different species and they could all succumb to it and get really sick and maybe not even make it. So enzootic means something that kind of just exists in a species. Epizootic is like a disease episode where it's basically an outbreak within that population. And we're going to talk about different types of diseases today. So congenital diseases are diseases that are present at birth, inherited due to their genes from their parents. They can also be random mutations that cause these congenital diseases. They tend to be rare in wild animals because natural selection usually doesn't allow that animal to be very successful. It may persist in rare levels if it's not fatal. So albinism is an example, depending on the species, that may persist or not. Typically, only that individual will be an albino, and then its offspring probably won't be. But you got a really cool looking squirrel there. There was a recent, just I think in the last couple months, an albino, I want to say a whale, lived off the coast of Washington. I can't quite remember. I think it was a whale. Or it had partial albinism. Animals can have disease due to nutritional deficiencies because of poor diet or something that's stopping them from absorbing or storing the nutrients that they need. Obviously, if animals aren't getting the nutrition that they need, it makes them weakened and susceptible to other things that could cause early death. Toxic diseases, these occur when animals are exposed to toxins, and toxins disrupt something that's happening in their normal functions. When we talked about pollution in the environment, we talked about how it can grow with different trophic levels, right? A little bit in the algae, the zooplankton eat that multiple times and it builds. Sand lance eats that multiple times, it builds, then the salmon, then the killer whales, and the idea that toxins can build up and cause disease. We know that animals and humans can have parasitic diseases. A macroparasite, macro means big, so it's like a specific, usually organism like a nematode, which is a worm, flatworms, mites, or botflies. They can be ectoparasitic, which means external parasites. They can be endoparasitics, which is internal parasites, tapeworms and things like that that are literally inside botfly larvae, which are under your skin, or they can be on the outside, like we said, ectoparasitic. And then we have microparasite infections. These are tinier things that can infect. These are things that you can see under a microscope, typically not by the naked eye. Malaria is caused by a protist. Giardia is a protozoan. Ringworm is a type of fungus. You can see the result of the fungus, but you can't actually see the actual fungal spores. So, two kind of categories there of parasitic diseases. Diseases can be infectious. That means spread from one individual to another, usually from one individual of a species to another individual of the same species. But some diseases can spread among different species, and that's called zoonotic. COVID-19 being one of those. It didn't start in a human. And there's also been stories out there of, I think, a tiger at the Bronx Zoo has it, and some house cats have gotten it from humans. So that one can be zoonotic from animals to humans, humans to animals, we know for sure. Infectious diseases tend to be density dependent. So we know that when an organism is living in a dense kind of population, that it can be spread from one to another if it's more spread out and there aren't as many species and as many species interactions, then it can be spread less easily. So density dependent means depending on the number of species and how close they are, that determines whether or not you're likely to catch it. Our social distancing is hoping to improve that situation. So pathogens, all different types of pathogens can make animals sick. We have protozoa; those make malaria and trypanosomiasis. We have bacteria, um, viruses, fungi, parasitic worms, and prions. So lots of different sort of vectors that can make an animal or a human ill. So these are all vectors for disease here. We can see the mosquitoes with malaria, ticks with Lyme disease, rats with bubonic plague. The bat, I think, has now maybe been associated with COVID. Wild dogs with rabies and bats with rabies as well. All right. So, wildlife disease. Why do we care? Well, this goes back to it. We care because, number one, we care about ourselves, and animals can give diseases to humans that can kill humans. So, wildlife conservation is important for keeping animals healthy, right? We want, when we look at wildlife disease from the lens of wildlife conservation, we have to be doing our best to help prevent huge mortality events in animals. We also know that fragmentation, when we conserve with and animals are fragmented and different populations are separated from each other, it can lead to decreased genetic diversity, and then you can actually have a population that is maybe potentially more prone or not prone, more resistant to disease. So, by having fragmentation and not working on conservation, we kind of weaken the populations that are separated from each other and maybe strengthen them. But oftentimes, lack of genetic diversity is a negative factor. We know that island species are particularly at risk for wildlife disease because they are stuck in one location, and if it's a density dependent disease, it can spread and there's nowhere for them to go. And we're also aware that climate change will shift ranges, and with those ranges, diseases can travel with the animals, or animals can travel into areas where diseases exist that they hadn't previously experienced. So that can lead for a shift in disease as well. Um, and then in captive breeding, wildlife disease is obviously a real problem. You can't reintroduce animals that have disease into a population that doesn't. So it's very important to try to have healthy animals. So this is a sad example of an amphibian fungus. This is a fungus that blocks the skin from being able to breathe and kind of coats the outside of the skin, so the amphibian either dries up or can't regulate its moisture. 50% extinction rate once this fungus moves into an area. So within 6 months of this fungus somehow contaminating a waterway, they'll see over about 50% of these amphibians dead. And then it's spreading to others. And what they found is that the species that get these types of fungi can be both in areas that are protected, like conservation protection areas, and also unprotected areas. So scientists aren't quite sure specifically how this type of fungus gets spread. They're wondering if it's by humans moving infected individuals who haven't yet passed from one community to another, kind of collecting a frog and releasing it elsewhere, and the potential ramifications of that. Here's a bat fungus called white nose syndrome. You can see the little bat's nose up there. It infects these bats and it can destroy their wings. And something about this syndrome, oftentimes these kinds of funguses can actually change the way your brain works, causes them to leave their caves during hibernation when normally they'd be hibernating in the winter and to go searching for food. And because it's winter and there isn't food in the winter, they end up starving as they're searching for food. First became aware of it in 2007, and 80% of our bat population in the Northeast United States died since then. And that's a real problem. Bats serve a really valuable service of pest control, mosquito control, insect control. And without them, it can cost up to more than $4 billion a year. So there's actually a monetary cost to these lack of bats as well. And we believe that this disease, this fungus, was accidentally introduced by a European tourist in a cave in New York. Basically, it had been a problem in Europe, and then a cave where tourists go got infected. So that's just a guess. There's no, one person targeted as being responsible. Tasmanian devil, if you've never heard of the devil facial tumor disease, it's a super sad one. This is a transmissible, so they can pass it from each other, and it's a parasitic cancer that is 100% lethal. Once these animals have it, they will die from it within 6 to 9 months. And so they saw a 70% population decline in 80 years. And of the remaining Tasmanian devils, 80% of them have this disease, with the assumption that the other 20% could catch it. Um, Another thing that when they get this, it decreases the age that they can where they start breeding, and then they're not as healthy parents. Also, we're not quite sure why some females in the wild have started to show some degree of immunity. So perhaps some evolution at work. The fittest are surviving, or the ones that maybe have some genetics that are slightly resistant to this disease. Scientists have developed an immunization, and so they've been doing some captive breeding programs and releasing immunized devils in 2015 to try to increase genetic diversity. But the problem is, it's not fixing it for their offspring. It literally requires the shot, the immunization, for them to be protected from this cancer. Featherless penguins. So I looked up this a little bit. This is a kind of rare, unknown condition about why some birds just don't grow their feathers properly. And what research has shown is I'm trying to remember what I looked up. I think it was a 93% of the featherless penguins aren't going to make it. Obviously, feathers are important. They keep them dry. They keep them warm. It's what they use to regulate their temperature. And so when they have something that that it doesn't seem to that was the other thing, it doesn't seem to be something they can pass on to other individuals. It's just some of them have that problem. Kind of reminds me of like alopecia in humans, where some people lose their hair. Just these guys lose their feathers and don't usually grow them back, and they have smaller size and slower growth rates. So there's something going on inside the penguins themselves, and they don't usually live very long again because they can't trap in heat and stay warm and dry. Starfish melting disease, it has been around for 70 years, but scientists discovered the virus in 2014 because millions of sea stars from 6 different species were dying. And so they compared it to samples from more than 70 years ago and said, no, this virus has existed in these animals. And so it used to be enzootic, which means some of them have it, and it has become epizootic and is doing mass killings of these animals. Some potential ideas, I bet you're all thinking it. I wonder if climate change and other stressors are causing this to be a more serious condition than it has been in the past. Um, the Saiga antelope is a really sad story. Basically, they're an endangered species, especially because 85,000 of them died in one day from this disease. I believe it's a bacteria that they were passing back and forth to each other. But they were seeing huge percentages of massive populations dying. I want to say that 85,000 in one day was a 20% population loss for these antelope. And that was just one day. And so there was deaths before and after that. So that's an example of this herd density, dense kind of herding animal. And this disease hit them and it hit them hard. We also have salamanders. There's a fungus that's a threat to the North American salamanders. Salamanders that get this fungus, 96% of them will die from that fungus. And so, again, this is a fungus that's been around and is all of a sudden having impacts on these animals. So, wildlife disease, why do we care? Well, it can be zoonotic, which means it can start in wildlife and it can come into humans. It's very hard to control diseases that are new to humans because we might not have it might be a different type of disease, or in our case with COVID-19, a very different, novel, unique virus that we don't have similar diseases in our past that our body already has an immune system response to. As we interact with more and more animals, as humans kind of expand into the world, as we eat wildlife, as we interact with the world around us, we just constantly increase our exposure and our risk of these different diseases. We are the population that's unprepared for it. We are the ones that kind of are like the opposite of an invasive species in this case. We go in and we don't have any ability to fight these diseases or conditions that we come in contact with. An example of humans who mass illness and death in the past was the bubonic plague, spread by rats that had fleas on them. It killed 50% of the world population in about 541 AD and 20% of the remaining world population in the 1348 to 1350. Bubonic plague still does exist. When this PowerPoint was written, there was an outbreak spreading through Madagascar. So it's not gone. The Spanish flu. This is the flu in 1918 that I don't know about you, but I've been hearing a lot about because it was the last big kind of medical flu or virus issue since before COVID-19. One thing I've explained to my own kiddos is that the Spanish flu was really deadly in children, and whereas this one seems to be opposite. Kids would just collapse on the street and die from this illness. But you can see here, 50 million people died from this illness. The young and the healthy are the ones where the disease would appear and then they would die. Um, the world deaths in World War One was 17 million, as opposed to 50 million died from the Spanish flu. HIV is an example of an illness that humans got after it jumped from primates to humans. We know currently there's about 75 million people infected by HIV. 36 million are dead. It's an ongoing epidemic. In the United States, medications and treatments are readily available and really have dramatically changed the condition of someone with HIV from when I was a child to now. The chance of survival is huge. It's very rampant, though, in a lot of the African countries without the same access to treatment and medical care. So most of those deaths now are coming from those countries. Malaria. Malaria is transferred by a mosquito to humans. When infected mosquito bite humans, you can get malaria. There were 207 million cases in 2012, and every minute one child dies in Africa, which is really, really sad. A cool thing that you may remember learning about in biology, though, is sickle cell anemia, which is a condition mainly in people of African descent. The reason it's mainly in people of African descent is it's not a great disease to have. However, people with sickle cell anemia tend to be much more um, not susceptible to malaria. And so it kind of evolved as a beneficial. People who didn't catch malaria survived, and they kind of all had sickle cell instead. But it's much more common in African people of African descent because of those kind of evolving in the same area. Rabies. Rabies come from mammals like bats and rabid dogs and rabid foxes and rabid uh, what's the word I'm thinking of? Raccoons, other animals like that. There's about 60,000 cases a year. If you do not get treated, if you get bit by an animal with rabies and you get rabies in your blood, you will die. But treatment quickly will save you. Ebola, made a movie about that one. Another example of mammal vectors jumping to humans. There were over 10,000 cases in a recent outbreak, and this was considered an extremely deadly disease with over a 50% mortality rate for humans. If you ever heard of avian flu, H5N1, H7N9, these are bird vectors, right? They're not very common. They did have a 70% fatality rate for both. And the most sort of recent one in the news was in January 2014 in Canada. A good thing about these diseases is they evolve rapidly, and if they evolve into a weaker strain, it kind of disappears almost as quickly as it does up here. SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome, was started as an animal virus that recently crossed, had about a 10% mortality rate. Big outbreak in 2003 in Asia, spread to over 24 countries. Oh, and I made this slide to add one about COVID-19, and I couldn't really find any. Well, we're just not through it yet. I didn't have any concrete details, but unfortunately, COVID-19 is going to be on this PowerPoint as very, I think that was a higher, more deadly option, except for like the bubonic plagues. But for recent history, absolutely the most deadly novel virus coming from an animal to a human. So we care because animal diseases can transfer to humans and can lead to human loss of life. And also because it can go backwards. And again, COVID-19 has shown us that there's house pets and tigers and other animals that have gotten it from humans in the US. So, how do we address wildlife disease? Well, it helps to collaborate. When there's collaboration between conservationists, communities, governments, and health agencies, early warning systems, education about how to prevent disease transmission between human and wildlife, and when there's certain diseases that are endemic to a certain area, training locals to monitor those diseases and to be on top of things also helps. Information is good, taking precautions is good, and being aware of diseases and risks. Silly things like when you're done touching your pet lizard or your bird, you wash your hands because salmonella is a real disease, and things like that can be a really easy way to help keep yourself safe. Hope you are all well and safe. I miss you. I wish we were in class.